It's all about conversations. Arrow.net, ARROE.net. We are unplugged and totally uncut with Dr. Erin Kimmerle.
Good morning. Thank you for your interest.
Doctor, that's a voice of compassion. That's a voice of someone who really, you got to speak with truth when you use that voice.
That's right. Thank you.
What a heavy subject that you've got in this book. We carry their bones. I mean, it's a truth that needs to come forward. And you, when you walk into a town, people know you're there. And there's a lot of people that did not want you to be in that town, did they?
That's correct. There was a lot of pushback. It was definitely a challenge for a couple of years.
It's because you bring science with you. And with science, that means forensic. That means that you're going to be able to go in there and you're going to be able to do something that a normal person could never think of doing.
Yeah, it challenged their beliefs. And that's, I think that's inherently where the conflict lied. They had a certain narrative and story and version of events, and they just didn't want it challenged.
Is that because that's just the way, look, if the law says this is the way that it happened, then we have to agree with it. I mean, it's something drew you into this story.
What really drew me in, I think, and made it not personal, but almost personal, in a sense that I really felt very convicted about it was the families of the boys who had been missing. They would search for their brothers and uncles really their entire lives. And, they, like everyone else, I believed had the right to access the justice system. And those doors were being shut to them, not because of, our ability or the capacity that we have to do the work, but just because it was easier than saying yes. And so, that's where I think, scientists and academics can have a role in helping people.
The book we're talking about is We Carry Their Bones, The Search for Justice at the Dozier School for Boys. The parents innocently were trying to send their children to a school so they could reform the mind, body, and soul. Man, they were met with a tragedy on the other side.
Yeah, the boys that were sent there all were convicted. So even if in the end they were, 5 years old or orphans, everyone was sentenced by a judge. And the idea was to give them education and job skills so that they could return to society as productive citizens. At the time that it was set up, reform schools were common, but also Florida didn't have prisons. So it was a way to get children out of the convict lease system.
But I mean, even today we have these little areas where they send young adults and stuff like that too. But this can't still be happening even today, and this can't be the only school at the same time that did this.
It wasn't the only school. At the time in the 40s and 50s, it became the largest. But what's even more widespread and has a very, very similar backstory are the Indian residential schools, and that's been in the news a lot lately. There's over 350 in the United States. Children were forcibly, taken from their families, acculturated, punished for speaking their native language, and undoubtedly every one of those schools had deaths and burial grounds, and that's only just coming to light and really coming to the surface today.
There used to be an age when reform meant giving someone permission to go against the normal. This is really against the normal, what happened inside your pages.
Yeah, it was, it was supposed to be one thing and it turned out to be something else. And I think that's where, you see even from the earliest days, the school administrators had a PR campaign and really lobbied and tried to control the narrative to the media. Some of the earliest is from 1914, and so it made me think, when did people start doing press releases? And it was kind of an interesting a question, because they definitely worked very hard at maintaining that narrative.
Who set the standards at this school? I mean, it had to start somewhere.
Well, the school was run by the state. It was overseen by the state, but for most of its history in the early years and the really our work focused from about 1900 to about 1960. It was a group of individuals. And what's interesting is when they would offer reforms or make changes or change the name of the school, the people stayed the same. What would change is the superintendent himself, and that had a very high turnover rate. But certainly in the early years, it was the families who'd set up the school, which were local business owners and also farmers, and they were the ones who had contracts in the convict lease system, and that's the ones who wanted the labor, and that's what they used the children for.
We're talking 31 or more bodies, unmarked graves, school property. Did anybody on the outside begin to wonder and start questioning?
Yeah, throughout its history, the school was under constant state investigation almost annually. There were also state and congressional hearings. For a period of time in the 1980s, federal government took the school over. I think what shocks most people is that it closed only in 2011, and that was under pressure from, an investigative journalist, Ben Montgomery, who was doing so much work and so many articles about not just its history, but its current state. And so finally the state closed it.
Speaking of investigative journalists and things like that, the way that you have laid out this book, We Carry Their Bones, reminds me so much of the way Geraldo Rivera got into that hospital up in the New York area and was able to unveil the truths about that. Do you feel like that your next step is going to be in journalism?
Well, I think I'm too much of an academic at heart and love the field work. So any chance I get to actually go out and just be in the field, doing it is really my passion. But I did enjoy ultimately writing this book. It took a long time. I had to kind of step away from it for a while. And there's certainly some other work we've done with cold cases and unsolved homicides, particularly looking at female victims. And so I'd like to be able to write that in a way, similar to this, that will capture a broader audience, because it's a problem that I don't think a lot of people, think about or realize the scope of.
When you're inside the world of forensic anthropology, one of the things that I've always loved about this is the fact that every human cell tells a story. Do you find yourself connecting those stories together, and the deeper you dig, the more things are revealed?
I think so. I think, and I think what, like if you look at just this story as an example of that, what interests such a broad audience and so many people is it just crosses all sort of lines. It doesn't really matter, who you are, your background. It just innately is this, injustice involving children. And I think we can all relate to that. And so I do think that as a scientist as well and an educator, I think that that's what we can do is use, examples such as this to look at bigger lessons.
Inside your paragraphs, you bring up a name that for many people over the past couple of years, they've been introduced to it, these generations today. But you bring up Jim Crow policies in this, and it's like all of a sudden Generation Z and millennials are going, oh, my God, there's that name again.
Right. Well, I think that is, well, let me put it this way. What struck me when I started to do the research and started, reading all the old documents, right? The school would write reports and documents to the state, and then they would lobby and the laws would change. Is you just can see that pattern so clearly where it's, you can just almost like step by step where it's like, okay, we don't have enough children here because truthfully, there's not that many kids convicted of crimes in 1900. And so we need more children because we can't bring in the crops. And so they lobby for it. And now there's longer sentences and things that aren't really crimes like incorrigibility and skipping school are suddenly crimes. I mean, you're picked up by the sheriff and prosecuted and a judge sentences you to a labor camp. And so you see these sort of, the laws change for this purpose. And that's exactly what was happening generally when it came to issues of race. All the vagabond laws, you're arrested for being in a city where you don't have a residence and so forth. And all of that really creates a labor pool through the convict lease system. So this is a mirror of that. It wasn't, it was supposed to sort of bring children out of it, but when it's set up by people who are working in the convict lease system, of course, the result is pretty much the same. So throughout its history, I would just say too, you just see one example after another. Before there's civil rights protections, it's like, how does this happen? How does this happen? And children are taken into custody. There's no legal representation. Parents aren't notified. There's no sort of recourse. There's no way to appeal it. And all these protections that we kind of, think are just inherent today were really hard fought and won through the civil rights movement. And that, this is just such a good example of why that was so critical, and it's still critical today.
Those that lost their lives, how was that reported to the record keepers? Is it just an MIA? What happened here?
In many cases, it was never reported, and that's where you see the discrepancy. So there was a ledger that the school kept, and they would, when a boy came in, his name was put in the book, and when he was discharged or paroled or ran away, children, they ran away. These boys ran away constantly. They get caught, brought back, and so all that's in the ledger. And when someone died, it would say died. Now, did they record it for everybody? No. The records are incomplete. There's a lot of inconsistencies. There's a lot of challenges with historic records. But that was really the best that we had. Even after 1917, when death certificates were required, many did not receive a death certificate, even into the 40s. And so, it was never reported to the state body, the governor who was overseeing them, nor to vital statistics.
You talk about there were those that were able to run away or reported run away. Right away, I'm thinking this would be a breeding ground for human trafficking. People on the outside waiting for that next one to run away, promising that I can show you a better life, and they end up going into a different direction.
Yeah, that's a good point. And hundreds, probably thousands ran away. Many were returned because you have, it's a very rural place. But many, we don't know what happened to them. It was beyond the scope of what we could do to, try to do the genealogy and track down everybody. So, and that's led a lot of the White House boys and others to think that even more died, which is possible. It's just, there's no evidence for it either way. And so we had to really focus on those that we had some sort of record for, even if we didn't have their name.
The book we're talking about is We Carry Their Bones, and that the title is literal. It really is. Because you're reuniting these children with their families. How are families receiving this news? Is it something that, that they feel like that we knew this was happening, it did happen, now we can finally find peace?
I think that, the families were very involved. They were the heart of the sort of effort and movement to do the excavation. That's what they wanted, and that's what I would point out is, of course, those who opposed it thought, this was something that we wanted. It's not. It's what the families wanted. And so they worked really hard. They met with legislators. They did press interviews. And many of them were, they're in their 70s and 80s and had never been public before, but, did whatever they thought would help get support publicly and legislatively to get this approved. And so they were very, invested in it. And I think grateful is the word I would use. It was still sad, the sorrow and the tragedy is still there for them. It's not like you're ever okay with it. I don't know that, I think, but I think in terms of like finding peace and feeling like there was some measure of justice, at least the acknowledgement was huge relief for them. And of course, they learned more about the school and in some cases about what happened to their, specific brothers than what they had ever been told, because they never were properly notified. Mm-hmm. And no one ever explained the situation, even in cases where, boys went on, there was one boy in particular, Earl Wilson, who was killed. Other boys were charged and convicted of his death, that's
Oh my
debated.
God.
But even the family never knew the details of that. They weren't at the trial. They didn't, they never really had a full understanding of what happened. And of course, questions anything the school did say. They didn't really trust the official accounting. So in some cases, we were able to find more information. And I think that filled in some gaps.
Is this going to be a 6-part to a 12-part series on Netflix? Because it's got the strength to make it happen.
I don't know. I think we did a documentary a couple of years ago. Lifetime Movie Network did a documentary. I think they did a really nice job, and it follows the family's stories in particular. And so I don't know, but I think that there's a lot of relevancy, like I said, to the Indian residential schools. So hopefully that will be, hopefully they'll find some of the same information and access to justice that these families did.
Truth cannot be forgotten, and because of this book, we carry their bones. You are bringing forward the truth, and it's just one of those things that's going to change the future, and people need to know. And once again, through you, we are learning a lot about our history.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please come back to this show anytime in the future, Doctor. The door is always going to be open for you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It was nice to meet you.
Well, you be brilliant today, okay?
Thanks.